the gender debate's been happening for a long time, and I think part of what we were trying to do and have thus far succeeded in doing with the Society of Women is get some things back on track for young women and create a space where they can talk about other things that they want to care about more, that they want to give more of their headspace to when trans is constantly trying to force its way into every area of discourse when it comes to women. Because a room of women talking is now somehow threatening, that's why we must do it all the more and do it publicly and proudly and welcome any women who want to come in. There are consequences that, you can never undo, and that's harrowing. But that's all the more reason to limit the amount of those now, today, and to do that through valuing speech and civil debate, through advocating for truth, and, not letting harassment and abuse and hostility get you to self-censor at all.
From no platforming to designated safe spaces, free speech on university campuses has become a political flashpoint in recent years, and few topics have been more contentious than gender identity. One student who stepped directly into this debate is co-founder of the Cambridge University Society of Women, Maeve Halligan, who I'm so delighted to welcome today. Maeve, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I do want to talk about your amazing speech that you gave at the Cambridge Union recently, which has gone viral. I'm so glad so many people have watched it. But before we do, take us back to the beginning. You arrived at Cambridge last year, you're a master's student, you're walking around the Freshers' Fair. What makes you go, I don't actually want to join any of these existing women's societies or feminist societies, of which I'm sure there are many at Cambridge. I actually want to go and co-found my own.
Because they're not women's. It's as simple as that. I walked around, and so obviously Cambridge is collegiate, there are 31 colleges. Every single one, to my knowledge, or definitely 30, have FemSocs as they're known. Some are more active than others, but so you really have there's a large bunch of feminist societies. And I believe that a feminist society can be mixed sex. In fact, I think it's really important to involve young men, boys, and adult men in discussions about feminism and about sex equality and all of this stuff. But I thought that there would be at least a few kind of university-wide societies as opposed to college-based ones that would be women-only, or, that would focus solely on women's sex-based rights and issues. I thought that, to be honest, I don't know. I was naively optimistic, maybe, especially because, as you say, I started at Cambridge in October of 2025, obviously in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling in April of the same year. So I thought that maybe other students might have, even on the down low and not been especially public about it, started something that was for women only, in terms of the biological females. But there wasn't anything. And I walked around and spoke to students who were running these feminist groups, I suppose, including, magazines and publications, societies that were kind of hobby-based, like music or creative art societies or whatever, that had women in their titles, but all of them had some kind of caveat, an asterisk, or and non-binary, or women, AFAB, which stands for assigned female at birth, and trans women. There was always this kind of listing, almost in a sort of frantic, we are inclusive, we are progressive. And I went around and I talked to some of the women sitting behind these tables, and was like, well, look, when you say women, what do you mean? And they didn't think, partly I guess I'm a young woman myself, and I don't know, my appearance, they didn't think that I was asking that in any sense, like a loaded way. And they were all like, well, women, and we include all women. And I was like, what, so trans women? And they were like, yeah. And I was like, well, trans women are men. And then they looked at me like I just shot their dog. It was very bad. So I left the Fresh Fair feeling, disillusioned, I suppose, and angry. And then I spoke to my two friends, Serena Worley and Thea Sewell, who are both undergraduates at Cambridge, just finishing their second years. I knew them before having met them at the Oxford Literary Festival back in April of 2025, when Helen Joyce and Julie Bindel were speaking. And we were kind of in an online community of young gender critical people. And I said to them, look, this doesn't exist. I think we should start it. Now is the time. I think people would join, women would join, and I think we have a clear mission and a clear message. Let's go for it. And credit to them, they both, agreed. And we've worked together since on building a society that now has, coming up to 50 members. We've had multiple really successful guest speaker events, the majority of which have been open to the public. But we also run kind of discussion groups. We have a little book club. the fact that we've only existed for less than an academic year still, we've enjoyed a lot of success and crucially a lot of public support, which we really, really appreciate and has helped us, to continue to exist and stress test the system at the University of Cambridge. Part of that support has been in terms of people very kindly donating to us, which has also been extremely helpful. So yeah, it's gone well so far, basically.
Good. And when you started that society, when you were talking about setting up the Cambridge University Society of Women, were you posing that as an explicitly gender critical society? Was that the pitch?
Good question. The short answer is no. I mean, we called it the Cambridge University Society of Women. I came up with the name literally thinking it's as simple as that for us, because the criteria for membership, you have to be a current student and you have to be a woman. And on that basis, by the way, that negates any claims that we're trans exclusionary, because we would accept trans identifying women, or trans men as they're sometimes known. And so, look, definitely an important issue that women, and especially young women, I believe, should discuss is gender ideology, is trans, in terms of how it poses a threat to women. But it's not like there's a shortage of other issues, and that's why our events thus far have, been on topics like FGM, prostitution, porn and porn culture, intergenerational feminism and what that looks like, all of these things. So we've made quite a conscious decision throughout to not constantly platform trans as a kind of primary issue all the time, because I think the gender debate has been long, frustrating. We've had some important kind of legal victories within it, and also a lot of really difficult times for individuals who've suffered in terms of job loss of livelihood, massive social ostracisation, online harassment and all the rest of it. So the gender debate's been happening for a long time, and I think part of what we were trying to do and have thus far succeeded in doing with the Society of Women is get some things back on track for young women and create a space where they can talk about other things that they want to care about more, that they want to give more of their headspace to, when trans is constantly trying to force its way into every area of discourse when it comes to women.
And you mentioned you'd had a lot of support when you set up the society. Was there also some pushback?
Yeah, there was a lot. This is different than if I had called up my mates and been like, do you want to set up a club about anything else, isn't it? Because it's charged. And the fact that we were openly and proudly single sex, which in a lot of people's minds functionally makes us exclusionary and regressive as opposed to progressive and all of this stuff, I knew that it would be controversial, to put it lightly. The way that pushback manifested itself in Cambridge itself has been, at the start it was bad, and it's definitely dropped off a lot. But it was just students coming up to us in the street, having a go at us, calling us Nazis and fascists and all the rest of it. Online, there was loads. A lot of societies adopted this policy of statement making, which basically consists of where they make an Instagram post, kind of like a little infographic, being like, this is why the new turf sock is abhorrent and nobody should join it and they should be kicked out of the uni. So there was a lot of that kind of thing. But to be honest, yeah, as I say, because we exist, we registered with the university officially, which was really important and legitimizes us. We also registered with the SU, which is not mandatory, but I wanted to do kind of to make a point, I suppose, to legitimize us again. And because we've had these events, because it's been successful, basically the message now, I think, is kind of, we're not going anywhere. So a lot of students have given up trying to run some sort of campaign to shut the society down. The pushback, in a weird kind of way, I did not enjoy it at all, and it was extremely stressful and disappointing and a bit disheartening, because at the end of the day, these are my peers, this is our generation, and it's also our generation at Cambridge, which is supposed to be a marketplace of ideas and a space where ideas are challenged and a space where thinking is valued and should be able to be done freely. So it was a bit rubbish, but at the same time, the pushback validated our reason for existing in the first place, and because this is controversial, it must happen. Because it's controversial to organise, to associate on the basis of sex, because a room of women talking is now somehow threatening, that's why we must do it all the more, and do it publicly and proudly, and welcome any women who want to come in.
And there's been so much talk in general about free speech on campus with universities. Do you feel that it was maybe just this particular issue was so contentious, or is this indicative of a wide problem where people can't really speak up the way they want to on campus?
You're exactly right. There is a wider problem. I'm glad that that's talked about more now. The the speech about freedom of speech is good. But I think the gender issue is singular, because I don't think there is any debate right now that is so, involving of people denying a factual reality. Like, to put it like this, some people might think that the gender stuff's a question of opinion, but it's not really about opinion. It's about willingness to acknowledge fact, and a fact that's immutable and unchanging, fundamental, which is biological sex, and also the fact that biological sex is important and it matters, especially in certain areas of life, like when you think about single-sex facilities, specifically for women, everything ranging from your public loos to rape crisis centres, but also things like sport, fair competition, but also things like, legislation and policy making. When sex matters, it really, really does. So the fact that the debate about it has become so emotional and so kind of driven by the more abstract concept of identity, gender identity specifically, I think that singles it out as an issue that is so different from stuff where opinion really can and should figure in a different way,
And you'll be aware of this, but there's been so much talk about whether gender ideology and progressive ideologies in general are more intense among young women. Is that something that you recognise in your experience?
100%, yeah.
Why
Yeah.
is that?
I mean, look, it sounds a bit odd, but like I'm quite weird in my not in my stance, but in my willingness to declare it publicly. That is not normal among young women. That's why, with the speech that I made at the Cambridgeian a little while ago, I think that's part of why it's been, engaged with a lot online, whether positively or negatively, because it's not normal to see a young woman standing up in defense of acknowledgement of biological sex and therefore standing up to dissent against the kind of trans dogma. Yeah, so young women are definitely the demographic that are most likely to proclaim support for trans stuff and transness, trans ideology, whatever you want to call it, as a result. And that's partly because, firstly, we're just wired to be more sort of driven towards empathy and the empathetic stance and stuff. But it's also because the social pressure to conform in this case among young women is incredibly high. And also the social currency and the social reward, if you like, from openly being a massive ally of the trans movement is also very high. It's, it's a trend, but it's also a system whereby you are rewarded for going along with it and you are absolutely punished for going against it. And that punishment, as I've said, can look like general kind of harassment and abuse and all this, but also social ostracization. They'll pay attention to you to have a go at you, but the rest of the time, people will make it their business to ensure that you become incredibly lonely. And so you feel like you are strange for having the view. I don't acknowledge that. I acknowledge that it's strange to be able to declare it publicly, but I don't think it's strange to think this. In fact, I know that a lot of young women agree with, what I've said on this for the past 18 months or so. You can go deeper into the kind of why this sells with young women. You can. But I guess what I'm interested in predominantly is the fact that this ideology really, really harms young women, ironically. Like, they're one of the demographics who are the biggest cheerleaders, but they're also a demographic that are massively at the sharp end of it. So it's a very, very self-destructive trend among young women at the moment. And I think that's part of why I felt very strongly that me and other young women needed to visibly and publicly make a bit of a stand, and create a space, most importantly, for other young women to come together and talk about this, although, as I mentioned, other issues as well.
And you talk about being wired for empathy, and in your speech you mentioned this "be kind" mantra, and it has such a grip on young women. I completely agree with that. I find it interesting that you say you were a bit weird and that you were willing to take a stand and not just believe it and go quiet, but you were saying, no, I'm actually going to believe it and say it. What do you think is the difference between a young woman who's able to do that and one that's not?
Lord, you could start talking about nature, nurture and stuff, couldn't you? But also, I think, personality and character and stuff probably come into it, sure. But at the same time, I think it's because I found out about trans fairly young, because I was 13 in like 2016, and it's often, the kind of general agreement is that trans stuff really picked up, especially among young women, in terms of more young women started deciding that they were in fact boys or men, as the case may be, in about 2015. So I really remember it starting to happen. I remember it like hitting my school and kind of seeing it, begin um, among my peers, especially my female peers. So basically, I kind of was looking at it from the off in this kind of new iteration of it that we're in now. And so I was basically, because I was skeptical right from the start, I never agreed with it. I never understood it. And I sought to, but I never felt that I was in some sense an ally to this movement or anything. So I think part of why I'm able to talk about it publicly now is because I've known about it's probably the thing that one of the things I've known the most about for the longest time in some ways, because I followed it and I followed the, moments of, legal change and, sort of events that have happened within the gender critical movement and also within the trans lobby. I followed it for a while. So I guess I'd just reached a bit of a breaking point with it, really, especially because the Supreme Court had ruled that sex in the Equality Act 2010 means biological sex. And obviously, Bridget Phillips been pissed about for ages with guidance. It's now come out and people are still annoyed. That was slightly inevitable. But the fact that there was so much dragging of feet, especially in institutions, so Cambridge being one of them, that were willfully ignoring the law and as a result endangering women, children, the LGBT population and all the rest of it. Like, I was annoyed, yeah, and frustrated. And to be honest, I dealt with, difficulty socially because of this view a bit during my time as an undergraduate. And I sort of felt like I had nothing to lose. And I would rather my time at Cambridge be shaped by controversy because of being honest than, be maybe calmer and probably quite a lot easier, but in a way that involves me, self-censoring.
And I know that you talked about the impact on the LGBT community a lot in your Cambridge Union speech.
Yes.
And you questioned who is LGBT activism actually for. Can you expand a bit on those concerns you have?
Sure. So for reference, the motion at the Cambridge Union, the debating union, was this house believes modern LGBTQ plus activism fails its community. So there are a couple of things you can pick up on in the motion itself. One, the modern element, and that's why in the speech I was very keen to, ensure it was understood that I have nothing but support and positive feelings towards a lot of the, progress that has been made in terms of rights for same-sex attracted people generally, be it marriage, be it age of consent, whatever it is. But the modern bit, that's the key. In this 10-year chunk that I'm talking about, like since about 2015 up until now, we're 11 years now, that's where it's clearly started to go wrong. And because the T was tacked on to the LGB, that's what started to corrupt the movement as a whole. That's why, in fact, you have a lot of LGB people saying LGB without the T, because they don't recognise trans as a kind of relevant part of the community that they do have. To the extent that, as I kind of also said in the speech, to be pretty blunt about it, yeah, if you have same-sex attracted people, that's threatened by something that denies sex in the first instance. So there's a clear issue there. And then you can add the Q and the plus and the IA and all the rest of it as well. But the point is, again, I said this in the speech, you have heterosexual people who are attracted to the opposite sex and homosexual people who are attracted to the same sex. And then you have bisexual people for whom it is both. And in all of those definitions, that necessitates an acknowledgement that there are, in fact, two sexes, which is true whether you acknowledge it or not as well, because it's a fact. But, modern activism, trans specifically in the trans lobby, as I'm saying, it's massively, massively overstepped. I think, well, in fact, I know there used to be a far higher acceptance, a kind of neutral feeling towards transsexualism, as it used to be called, because there was no kind of, pernicious demand for privileges wrapped up in this idea that they were just asking for rights. This is the modern phenomenon of the trans lobby, because you've got people either absolutely denying biological sex or saying it's totally changeable or saying it's arbitrary. And that's when you end up with the rolling back of sex-based rights for women, also for men. But the reason that, we separate men and women is not symmetrical. We separate them for different reasons in certain instances in, society generally. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that trans threatens a lot of different demographics. Also, though, it threatens people who are under that trans umbrella themselves. For example, again, I touched on this extensively in the speech, children who are suffering with gender dysphoria, which is a thing and is difficult and does necessitate therapy and things. And it also, the fact that it's so many girls and young women now who are suffering this gender dysphoria, I think is outrageous. And I think to be truly progressive is to demand from society that women never ever have to feel that their body is in some way wrong, let alone that they should change it.
And just a few months ago, we were gearing up to have puberty blockers trials for children in this country, which is, something that I actually feel the majority of the British public would actually took a really firm stance on and said, absolutely no, not having that. And that's paused at the moment, thankfully. Hopefully we'll never see or hear of it again. But in terms of, looking after children who probably will go on to be LGB, or children who maybe have had confusion in puberty and are being told, oh, the reason that you feel that way is because you're born in the wrong body. Something interesting you touched on, which I think a lot of people shy away from because they don't want to seem conspiratorial, is who serves to benefit from all of this, who serves to benefit from getting children into gender clinics. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, it's a money spinner. It's lucrative. It really, really is. If you're transing vulnerable children and telling them all the time, by the way, if you don't do this, your child will kill themselves, which I think is evil. If you're bringing death into the room like that, if you're implying that your child will take their life if you don't put them on a medical path, which, by the way, massively harms them physically anyway. So it's basically saying hurt their health or lose them altogether. And it's this awful little mantra of, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter kind of thing. We now have medical professionals. I use that term quite lightly. We now have people who are charged with, improving, lengthening, or saving lives, promoting something that we know harms children, and frankly is also, it's fallacy. You'll never actually change your sex. This term transition, it's not describing an actual ability to, make some kind of crossover from being biologically male into being biologically female. It's not possible. We're chromosomally sexed. So it's massively concerning that you've got doctors and surgeons and also therapists who are adopting this affirmation model, affirmation only. And yeah, when you think about why, it's because of money. In a lot of cases, it really is. So one of the people in the debate on the opposing side, so against me, was Dr. Helen Webberley, who's a GP of just over 30 years. But she, along with her husband, who was a doctor also but was struck off, they set up an organisation called Gender GP. I can't remember exactly when, but they set it up. And then it operated from Spain and now operates from Singapore. This is all publicly available information. It's on the Wikipedia. And it's very murky. And, their website, there's a kind of sign-up fee of just under £200. But basically their website is kind of colourful and welcoming and, it doesn't seem in any way sinister. But just reading it and remembering what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about trans kids, and that should mean medical intervention. That's so worrying. And also a lot of not just Gender GP, but there are people in the medical sphere generally who encourage children not only to transition but to conceal the fact that they seek to do so from their parents. And from adults generally. In fact, you've got teachers concealing children's social transition in school, for example, from those children's parents, and doing so on the basis of it being their safeguarding duty. In terms of who backs trans, for young women, as we've talked about, there's social currency in it, in being an ally. It's trendy, it's good, it means you're good morally. But when you look at the medical side of things, Helen Webberley's seeing dollar signs for every kid that she tells needs to change their body irreversibly, isn't she? And that's really, really, really concerning. I mean, the Hippocratic Oath is first do no harm, and I wonder what these doctors think when they're giving children drugs to forever alter their bodies and, by the way, sterilize them.
And when you think about the amount of people who are raking in money from medicalizing vulnerable children, or even when you think about biological men who are sort of strapping on fake breasts and inserting themselves into women's spaces, bullying biological women, that's a really anger-inducing thing. But you made the point at the end of your speech to say, the people opposing me, I don't think you're terrible people. I don't think you're bigots. Do you think in the scope of the entire gender ideology debate, those people who are more self-serving, maybe even malicious in a way, are actually way outnumbered by the people who have been victimized by trans or just swept along in it?
Yeah, I guess you're asking a question of culpability. I think anybody profiting off of it is definitely at the extreme of like who I'm going to point the finger at, if anyone, because, logically that's just true. But in terms of, allies, well, I said I don't think they're bad people, and I said that I think they're being fed a lie, and it's a lie that's been, tied to self-worth in terms of people's perception of their moral self-worth. What I mean is, yeah, I've kind of said it already, but this idea that if you go along with trans, that's evidence of you being a good person and of you being truly kind. And that's, again, why it sells among young women, because that's something that we're more wired to value. Yeah, there are people who are swept along. That's exactly right. And I get why. I mean, being a trans ally, people dress it up to make it look really fun, and they use words like inclusive and welcoming. They use words like true and lived experience, and authenticity is always part of the language as well. So it's this idea that if you resist trans or in some way don't only encourage someone to transition, there's this idea that you are limiting that person's rights to become their true self. And that leads me on to another thing, which is this language of rights. You've now got people saying, because trans women are women, they deserve the same rights as any other women. And, I could talk for an hour about how ridiculous the mantra trans women are women are, and it's such a circular definition and all of that. But when you start talking about rights, that's totally wrong. It's a misnomer. What you're asking for when you ask for a man to have access to women's single-sex spaces is you're asking for a privilege. And you're asking for an unchallenged ability to exploit a system that we have in place in society for reasons that everybody already knows. I mean, it's something that I've said to students, because bear in mind, all of these students that have come up to me and said, just so you know, you're a bitch or whatever. So I sometimes try to talk to them, and I'm like, why do you think we ever bothered separating the sexes? Like, why do you not why do you think that nobody's ever really questioned or challenged the idea that we'll have some in society, some male spaces and some female spaces? Precious few when you think about it, by the way. Why do we do that? Why is there a women-only hospital ward? Why have we bothered? And, some people will acknowledge, they're like, because men pose a threat to women. But then as soon as you bring in the idea that trans women are in fact women, then you can just easily slot that in to your acknowledgement of the fact that we, separate men and women, if that makes sense. I mean, there are so many issues in that thinking process, but it is happening. So you do have people who kind of think themselves into this corner, but they haven't reasoned themselves there at all. So that's partly why a lot of people have quietly binned it off and are starting in themselves to dissent, and that's a really important first step. That's why I'm keen to provide a space for women to come and do that among women, and that's why I'm happy that there is ongoing public discourse and trans allies speak and expose the issues in their points of view all the time, which is quite helpful. What we've ended up with now is a situation where being a trans ally or a trans identifying man, especially fetishistic men and stuff, is now not as easy a ride as it probably used to be. It's not as trendy as it used to be. But what that means is all the people that are left there, this is a hill they will die on. So you get the kind of most adamantly invested people, some doctors, some parents of children who have been transed, some real social justice warriors. Those are who you have left now. And a lot of those people will never, ever, ever see the light, if you like.
And I'm sure since you became more publicly gender critical, shall we say, people have jumped to say, oh, well, you must fall on this side of the political aisle or this side of the political aisle. Do you feel strongly that this is actually a non-partisan issue?
Yeah, it's actually really important to acknowledge that being gender critical isn't party political. It's a little quip. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But it's true. I don't think it should be the case at all that acknowledging the reality of sex and thus promoting the idea of sex-based rights rather than gender identity-based privileges, that is not a party political issue. Now, when you look at the current political situation, of course, it is the case that, look at what Bridget Phillipson, who's obviously Labour, regardless of what is she actually believes in herself, what she's doing is obviously not on the side of the gender critical movement. But that's not to say that Labour as a whole is totally, totally captured. It kind of, and also Labour isn't the left. I should say that there are so many women and men in the gender critical scene, whether really, really publicly or not so much, who are absolutely left-leaning people. I think I mentioned in the speech, to kind of make this point, I only had 10 minutes, so I couldn't unpack everything. But the LGB Alliance, for example, which is an organisation for same-sex attracted people that organises on the basis of sex and acknowledges sex and all of it, that was set up by two lesbian women who are left-leaning, in the UK. There are so many people. I mean, look, Julie Bindel is a great example. Rosie Duffield, in fairness, yeah, she left the Labour Party partly due to her gender critical views, but that doesn't mean that she stopped being left leaning altogether. It's cross party. That brings you back to why I think it's singular, because it's political, but your view on it doesn't necessarily dictate whether you're right or left leaning.
And when we had Helen Joyce on recently, this was exactly 1 year on from the Supreme Court ruling on biological sex. She was telling us about what hadn't changed institutionally. But I wonder, to finish us off, have you seen any shift conversationally in this country in the way that people are talking about gender and talking about trans? And do you feel positive that at least people are more able to discuss it now than they were before?
I feel positive, partly because I try to be that way anyway, and partly because this current debate surrounding gender is so maddening and disheartening and frustrating and often, really harmful to so many different people. If I didn't feel optimistic, I wouldn't get up in the morning. And also, if I didn't feel optimistic, I wouldn't have bothered setting up Society of Women. I wouldn't have bothered going into that room and making the speech. If I thought it was a lost cause, I'd bow out. So, of course, I think that what I'm saying is true and it's a kind of truth will out situation. I think there is shift. There absolutely is. Young women, it's difficult to be a young woman myself because young women are shifting very, very slowly. And also, as we've discussed, even if young women do agree with me, they'll do so privately. And even if they do so privately, they'll pretend to themselves that they don't, kind of thing. It's this. When I say brainwashing, I am not. That's not hyperbolic. I think even if you anonymously polled young women, many would struggle to, tick the box saying, yeah, sex does matter. Even something as simple as that. This is in deep. It's got its hooks in very, very deep into institutions, but into the minds of individual people. And so on that basis, there's room for, feeling disillusioned and feeling a bit pessimistic sometimes. But overall, there are some very, very, courageous and interesting and intelligent people on the side of truth here. Helen Joyce, of course, being one of them, and the organisation Sex Matters. She's director of advocacy. There's a lot going for the gender critical movement. And luckily, truth and fact and scientific reality are only a few of those things. There's a lot more. I'm happy that the debate remains ongoing in public discourse because, a lot of the maddest people on the trans side of things, they self-expose, no pun intended. So, whenever they say mad stuff like, fuck you bitches, I'm going to use the women's loo, try to stop me, and then they go in and take selfies, they're terrible ambassadors for what it is they're trying to promote. They're pretending that they're no threat to women. And then, just the other day in Parliament Square, because of the bathrooms thing, you literally had trans-identifying people publicly urinating to make the point that they should be able to go and use whatever bathroom they want. And if that isn't, odd, potentially threatening, outrageous behaviour, I don't know what is. So, yeah, I reckon that there will be a time when we can look back and say, what the hell happened there? But the most important thing about that is that there are people who'll never be able to look at this retrospectively because it will be their reality for the rest of their life because they've been irreversibly medicalised. And, women who've been assaulted and harmed by trans-identifying men in their spaces, you can't erase that. So there are consequences that, you can never undo, and that's harrowing. But that's all the more reason to limit the amount of those now, today, and to do that through valuing speech and civil debate, through advocating for truth, and, not letting harassment and abuse and hostility get you to self-censor at all.
Maeve, thank you so much.